joining us as we continue our documentary on Hamas in the United States in episode 18. Thanks, Jennifer, for joining us again.
Thank you for having me, Laura.
At this point, we are rapidly proceeding toward present day, where we see a number of groups and individuals driving false narratives that foment hate and encourage violence. Some of those groups that we have mentioned, and we'll get into more deeply in the next episodes, are aligned with Hamas. Clearly, that's what we've been talking about. But others with whom they are currently collaborating align with leftist Marxist ideologies. And that is not insignificant.
Right. Yeah, I believe there have been some events in history when Islamist ideologies have merged with Marxist ideologies, like events that led to the Iranian Revolution in 1979, resulting in the institution of the current oppressive terrorist regime.
You are right about that. Although Islamists and Marxists have very different ultimate goals, their ideologies overlap in their critique of what they consider imperialism. Pre-1979 in Iran, many saw the Shah of Iran, who ruled Iran, as oppressive, but also as a puppet of Western imperialism. And the Marxist groups helped build labor and student movements, while the Islamists mobilized millions through their religious networks, right? They were aligned in their ultimate goal of displacing the Shah and detaching from imperialism. But the leftist groups were arguably naive in this alliance because ultimately the Islamists captured the revolutionary movement and the Marxists were sidelined after the Shah's fall.
And weren't many of those leftist movements who aided the Islamists, didn't they face severe repression under the Islamist regime?
Yes, and ironically, they were countering oppression and trying to install this revolution, but found themselves supremely oppressed by the Islamist regime. The Islamist regime began to ban leftist newspapers, arrest their leaders, force them out of politics. There were mass arrests and even executions. And women's rights suffered an unbelievable setback. I mean, let's take a look at some photos of women in Iran before the 1979 revolution, when everyone was oppressed, courtesy of BBC.
And now in Iran, women are imprisoned for not wearing their hijabs or covering their hair. It's even worse.
That's right. And remember the case of Mahsa Amini from 2022.
It's been 1 year since 22-year-old Mahsa Amini died while in custody of the morality police in Iran after allegedly showing too much hair beneath her hijab. Her death unleashed nationwide, even global protests against the Islamic regime. Since then, over 20,000 people have been arrested, over 500 have been killed, and at least 7 people have been executed. Nazanin Boniadi is an Iranian-born human rights activist, actress, and 2023 Sydney Peace Laureate. Thank you so much, Nazanin, for talking with us on this sad anniversary. Can you believe it's been a year?
Katie, it's good to be with you. I wish it was under better circumstances. If you would have asked me a year ago when I spoke to you last, do you think we would be in exactly the same situation a year later? I would have said no, because I genuinely thought that conditions would change. But we've had a brutal crackdown. The regime has killed over 500 protesters, imprisoned more than 20,000 protesters, executed at least 7, gassed, blinded, raped, tortured, forcibly disappeared Iranians.
I do remember that. It's so terrible. And this was not at all what the leftist groups had anticipated, before the 1979 revolution.
No, they really were seeking to be less oppressed. but found themselves in the opposite position. But all of this certainly led to success for the Islamists. But let's move forward to our topic today, the opportunistic merging of the Islamist groups and Marxist groups as it relates to the Palestinian conflict, and how that became prominent in the late 2010s, both here in the US and abroad. So we want to talk about that today, and we will start with an article published by the Palestine Chronicle.
Let me stop you here for a minute. I don't think we've talked about that publication on the series yet, right? This is a media outlet in the U.S. that has correspondents in Gaza and elsewhere. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. The editor is a man named Ramzi Baroud. Incidentally, his daughter is the digital media associate for the American Muslims for Palestine, the AMP, whom we've spoken about at length.
Yeah. And they report on events in Gaza and also report heavily on the SJP actions here in the U.S., but their reporting on them is in a positive light.
Yes, the reporting on the SJP encampment certainly is portrayed positively in the Palestine Chronicle. And they report on interviews of senior Hamas leaders. And this is fast forward a little bit, but in August of 2024, senior Hamas leader Khaled Mashal, that we've spoken about, told the Palestine Chronicle that students should seek an all-out confrontation and escalation of this conflict.
And we've spoken about Mashal before as the leader of the Hamas political bureau and who is the half-brother of convicted HLF defendant Masoud al-Qadir.
Yes, exactly. And the Palestine Chronicle has reported regularly on student protests, as we alluded to. Notably, as you pointed out, protests led by the Students for Justice in Palestine chapters. We're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit here because we're going to talk about that in later episodes. But it is worth noting that the Palestine Chronicle is currently the subject of litigation in Washington by 3 former Israeli hostages, people who were taken hostage by Hamas on October 7th. And in that lawsuit, they alleged that Abdul al-Jamal, a reporter for the Palestine Chronicle, held 3 of the hostages in his family home in Gaza for over 200 days. And according to this lawsuit, al-Jamal wrote weekly articles for the Palestine Chronicle reporting on the SJP's movements and activities while holding them captive. And he also allegedly told the hostages that Hamas had operatives in the student protests, and they would ensure that the United States, as well as Jews and Israelis, were hated everywhere. At this point, those are just formal allegations, so we'll have to see if evidence is introduced at trial in that matter to establish this is fact or not.
Yeah, let's keep an eye on that.
For sure. So, going back to the topic and the time period of today's episode, in 2023, the Palestine Chronicle reported that in 2018, which is our time period, Hamas and other terror organizations in the Gaza Strip agreed to a process to unify their armed, what they called resistance, read terror acts against Israel. In conjunction with this, the term unity of squares emerged to expand that unification between Hamas and these other groups across all of West Bank, Gaza, and Israel. This resulted in the creation of what they called a joint operation room, or a JOR. And according to what the article said, the JOR, they needed to create it to coordinate as a coordinating body for what they called military actions. The JOR was led by Hamas, but included Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine Resistance Brigades, the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades, and all total like 12 resistance groups. And the JOR began its operations in 2018. In an interview of Hamas leader Ayman Nafel in June 2023, which was republished in Palestine Chronicle, was illuminating. He said, there is a state of permanent communication and coordination between the components of the JOR, meaning Hamas, PIJ, PFLP, DFLP. He further stated, we mentioned the provision of command and control systems, strengthening communication between the components of the chamber, providing operational and intelligence situation assessments, sharing the aspect of logistical support and armament, as well as advancing practical and fruitful steps. And that was a quote. And when asked if the JOR had a centralized decision-making process, he said, quote, of course, the resistance today has reached a stage where war and confrontation can only be undertaken by a unified, collective, and thoughtful decision, end quote. In that June of 2023 interview, which again was re-reported by the Palestine Chronicle, an article that we will come back to later in later episodes, Nafal told Al Jazeera any future confrontation with the Israeli occupation will be a collective and deliberate decision by the Joint Operations Room of the Palestinian resistance factions.
Okay, interesting. Now, Hamas is in control, is that right?
Yes. And there is a valid question about whether or not Hamas really desired to be equal in these collective decisions, or if in true Hamas fashion, they created this JOR merely to strengthen their alliances and their numbers and to keep tabs on what everybody else was doing.
Yes, it seems that that is a valid question. Of those other factions you mentioned, the PFLP, and that is a leftist Marxist group, right, as is the DFLP. And they have a totally different ideology than Hamas and PIJ, who are Islamists.
Yes, totally different. Getting back to that thing, the Islamists versus the Marxist ideologies, we could spend days talking about the PFLP, which is a designated foreign terrorist organization by the United States. But let's do a very quick summary on them, just so we're all on the same page.
Right.
The PFLP was founded in 1967 in the wake of what is known as the Six-Day War by George Abbas, Wadea Haddad, and Ahmed Jibril. Its ideology was leftist Marxist, anti-capitalism, anti-imperialism. They saw Israel and the U.S. as symbols of imperialism, and they believed that the country of Israel should be annihilated.
So at the core, the same belief in eliminating Israel that Hamas had. And this is just different ideologies driving it.
Yes, same ultimate goal, different ideologies. And the PFLP, they well predated Hamas. The PFLP was part of the Palestine Liberation Organization decades before Hamas emerged. PFLP actually joined the PLO in 1968, so like a year after it was created. Some of their early acts of terror were very interesting. They included a July 23rd, 1968 hijacking of an El Al flight from Rome to Israel. Wadea Haddad orchestrated this hijacking, and it involved 3 terrorists, and it resulted ultimately in what they wanted, was the Israeli release of their prisoners.
And so the PFLP actually achieved a goal.
Yes. And so then again, on August 29th, 1969, so like a year later, the PFLP hijacked a TWA flight from Rome to Tel Aviv. A female named Layla Khalid and another PFLP member, Salim Iswahi, conducted the hijacking. According to news reports, Layla claimed she forced the pilot to divert to Damascus and fly over Haifa, where she was born. Upon landing, the passengers were removed and the PFLP blew up the plane.
Again, the hijacking resulted in prisoner release.
Yes, so this was a successful mechanism at the time, right? And in 1969, Rasmia Odeh, whom we've spoken about, orchestrated 2 bombings in Jerusalem, and 2 students were killed in the first bombing. She was convicted for that. We've referenced that before and imprisoned, but later released in a prisoner swap. We alluded to that in a previous episode.
Okay, so let's pause for a minute. We spoke about Odeh in a previous episode. So even though she was convicted of that terrorist attack that killed students, she migrated to the U.S. in 1994 and later naturalized. And she was then arrested in 2014 and placed in deportation proceedings.
Yes, fascinating story, right? We did speak about her, and we will talk more about her as pro-Hamas and pro-PFLP groups in the U.S. today use her cause as a rallying cry. It is a platform. But for now, just for a minute, let's go back to the PFLP and its activities because, it was getting even more interesting. So on September 6, 1970, the PFLP coordinated the hijacking of 4 planes. Layla Khalid, again, was involved in one of those. Say she had undergone plastic surgery to conceal her appearance, and she was able to board the plane carrying grenades in her clothing with no problem. So 3 of the hijackings were actually successful, but Layla's plot was foiled.
Wow, that's crazy on so many levels. You could board a plane with grenades in your pocket and nobody would even check.
So this event, though, yes, crazy, right? You think about the security that we go through today. It just didn't exist back then. Probably one of the reasons it does is because of all of these hijackings.
Now, direct from the CBS newsroom in New York, in color, here is Harry Reasoner substituting for Roger Mudd, with Charles Collingwood in London, Larry Pomeroy in Tel Aviv, Marvin Kalb in Washington, John Lawrence in Philadelphia, Phil Jones in Augusta, Barry Seraphin in Washington, and Hughes Rudd in Colon, Michigan.
Good evening. The Middle East conflict boiled over today with 4 airplane hijackings and the Israeli government pullout from the Middle East peace talks. Arab guerrillas have claimed responsibility for the hijackings, including one that was aborted at London's Heathrow Airport. CBS News correspondent Charles Collingwood reports.
The only plane that got away from today's Palestinian-orchestrated extravaganza of hijacking was significantly the El Al flight from Amsterdam, which made a successful emergency landing at London Airport. One would-be hijacker dead, the other subdued. El Al flights not only carry armed security guards these days, but the crews have been trained for just such emergencies. And when the hijackers made their move near the English coast today, the drill went into effect. The steward grappled with the gunman, his girl accomplice's arms were pinioned, and the pilot undertook violent acrobatics to throw the intruders off balance. The hijacker wounded the steward and was in turn shot dead by the guard, but the girl was subdued, and in spite of the extreme danger from gunfire in a thin-skinned jet, the flight made it into London still under El Al and not the hijacker's command. The passengers had all settled down out of Amsterdam when the hijack attempt erupted, but they kept their heads.
I was on the window seat, and the woman sat next to me, the man sat on the aisle seat. As a matter of fact, when they came in, they asked the stewardess for 2 seats together. It was a crowded plane, and she found these 2 seats that had been vacated by passengers who had got off in Amsterdam. Originally, he sat in the center seat, and the girl sat on the aisle. Then they chose to exchange places so that he was on the aisle seat. Then suddenly, we were in the air, sailing smoothly. I was reading, and they were very quiet. They didn't say a word to anyone, neither to themselves, to one another, nor to me. And then suddenly, he rose, and he let out a bellow, an animal-like bellow, and he had this little tiny pistol in his hand. And she ran after him, and the 2 of them were behind the curtains into first class, and then we heard some shots. It sounded like cap pistol shots, but apparently it was more than that.
What sort of people were they?
They looked quite ordinary. You would never pick them out in the crowd.
The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, to which today's coordinated series of hijackings are attributed, is a Marxist Palestinian splinter group. Its purpose was obviously to try to throw a larger monkey wrench into the movement toward peace in the Middle East than the guerrillas have been able to achieve on the battlefield itself. Charles Collingwood, CBS News, London.
There were 148 passengers aboard the El Al plane and nearly 450 aboard the 3 other planes which were hijacked and diverted toward the Middle East. All the flights were headed toward New York when they were hijacked, and 3 of the incidents occurred within a period of about an hour and a half. A TWA flight from Tel Aviv was hijacked shortly after takeoff from Frankfurt, and commando leaders say that it has landed at a revolutionary airport somewhere in Jordan. Swissair says that its jet from Zurich, hijacked over France, has landed at a military airfield in Jordan. Palestinian commando leaders said the plane would be held in an effort to secure the release of 3 commandos, prisoners in Switzerland since a shootout at an El plane in 1969. Pan Am's flight from Brussels, the only 747 jet hijacked today, was taken over after takeoff from Amsterdam and has landed at Beirut in Lebanon. The guerrillas professed pride in the hijackings. After the Swissair plane was taken, a woman identifying herself as an Arab commando called the Zurich control tower.
The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine informs you that its Rafik Assad commando unit is now in complete control on the DC-8 plane belonging to Swissair flight number 100 on its way from New York.
So this event led to a bloody confrontation between the PLO and Jordan because some of the flights were diverted to Jordan. And Jordan was very upset by what this was causing with all of this disruption. But the PFLP, along with the PLO, were expelled from Jordan in 1970 and then later expelled from Lebanon some years later. You know, the PFLP became marginalized in the PLO after that. And research indicates several issues or factors contributed to this. First, they were originally backed by the Soviet Union. That was one of their financial backers, according to reporting. And when the Soviet Union was disbanded, they really lost a lot of that support. And then, you know, with the rise of the Islamist group and the power and authority of Fatah, PFLP really lost a lot of its importance and relevance. It was really marginalized. But even though they were marginalized, they did not go away. And in fact, when we're looking at the Joint Operations Room that Hamas created in 2018 in Gaza, PFLP did in fact join and participate in that. And PFLP did in fact participate in the October 7th terrorist atrocities that we're going to talk about in future episodes.
So it seems like these groups with separate ideological principles seek to align when there is a common enemy. And regarding the current conflict between Hamas and Israel, the common enemy is Israel, but it's also the United States.
Yes, you're right. I mean, it is imperialism, right? Israel is a symbol of imperialism, as is the United States. In current times, the Islamist groups have aligned with the leftist Marxist groups to face a common enemy, or rather, enemies. All of the parties referenced believe Israel must be annihilated, and that armed force is justified in that pursuit. But they also believe in and advocate for the destruction of the West. Groups like PFLP and the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, especially their resistance brigades, believe Israel and the United States are symbols of imperialism that must be destroyed.
Well, the theory of imperialism as the enemy has certainly been a key element in protest activities in the U.S., even predating the October 7th terror attacks.
Yes. Hamas, as we've said a million times, is an Islamist movement and wants to establish an Islamist state in place of Israel. They and their parent organization, the Muslim Brotherhood, ultimately want to sabotage democracy by sowing discord, which they are very good at, and destroying us from within, which we've discussed in prior episodes. Different motivations for these groups, as we've said, same goal. So their alliance against a common enemy is opportunistic.
Well, we see similar alliances here in the U.S. as early as the mid-2010s, when Hamas aligned with groups such as SJP, AMP, and CARE to partner with PFLP-aligned groups and causes. And we should talk about some of those because it seems to be really relevant to the collaboration that mirrors what is happening abroad.
Right. So while Hamas, PFLP, DFLP, all those groups are collaborating in the Joint Operations Room in Gaza, what's happening over here? Let's talk about those organizations for a bit.
Okay. Should we start with maybe Samidun? Since we know that they have attended and held joint events with SJP and other groups that are noteworthy.
I think that is a perfect place to start. And I know you did some significant research on them. Why don't you tell us about Samidun?
I sure have done a little bit of research on Samidun, so I'm a little bit familiar with them. What I can tell you is they were founded in 2011. They describe themselves as an international network of activists. They also go by the Palestinian Prisoner Solidarity Network. So they advocate for the release of Palestinian prisoners, but in reality, these prisoners are convicted terrorists and terrorist financiers with deep ties to PFLP. And we just mentioned they're a designated terrorist organization. And I think what's most significant is their founder, Samidun's founder, is a senior leader in the PFLP. So I don't think you can get any more direct tie than that.
Very interesting.
And then by the late 2010s, they were coordinating with various SJP chapters and rallies and protests, echoing the themes of genocide and apartheid. And then in late 2018, they had a call to action to support the convicted HLF defendants alongside another pro-PFLP group that we'll talk about, I think, a little bit later, but called the Palestinian Youth Movement, also known as PYM.
Interesting. And I remember that. On their website, they referred to the convicted defendants of the HLF, the Hamas supporters, as pillars of their communities who were convicted on false charges. They claimed the trial was unjust, and their statement was endorsed by the National Students for Justice of Palestine, and even another PFLP-aligned group we will talk about shortly, the U.S. Palestinian Community Network. So we kind of see that, alliance there.
Exactly. And they also coordinated with events with SJP chapters, and they would later go on to call for the release of PFLP Secretary General Ahmad Sadat, who was in prison for terrorism in Israel. And then Samidun was designated as a terrorist organization by Israel in 2021, banned by Germany not long after that, And then last year, they were designated as a front for the PFLP by the U.S. and Canada. But I think we'll talk more about that later.
That is very interesting, though. And the point here is that pro-Hamas groups like the AMP and SJP joined forces with PFLP-aligned Samadun during this period, the late 2010s, to promote a narrative calling for the annihilation of the country of Israel and the release of imprisoned terrorists and terror supporters.
So, Laura, a great example was a 2021 National March in D.C. promoting the sanctioning of Israel, where CARE, there was a CARE press release that credited AMP partnering with CARE, partnering with MAS, Muslim American Society, and Samadun, among other groups.
Yes, and we mentioned a group called Palestinian Youth Movement, who also coordinated with these groups like Samadun, SJP, AMP, CARE. The PYM is also PFLP aligned. So let's talk about that for a second. So the Palestinian Youth Movement was officially established in the United States in 2009 and was reportedly founded by an assistant professor in Asian American Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. PYM focuses heavily on promoting reading material to its followers that classify terror attacks as resistance to Zionist colonization and imperialism, those terms that we're now becoming very familiar with. They glorify PFLP militant Layla Khalid. On January 22nd, 2022, PYM participated in a rally calling for the release, again, of PFLP Secretary General Ahmed Sadat, who had been sentenced to 30 years for leading PFLP and masterminding the assassination of a Israeli tourism minister. The event was held with Samadun and other organizations. Also, on October 8th, 2022, PYM was a co-facilitator for the American Muslims for Palestine for a conference in Southern California entitled Palestine, Action Towards Liberation. The event sponsored speakers such as Hatem Baizian of the AMP and SJP, Osama Abu Irshad of the IAP and AMP, and Hussam Alouche of CARE.
And I think this coordination continued and became very aggressive after the October 7th Hamas attacks. And I'm sure we'll discuss that later.
Yes, we will.
So, Laura, let's touch on the USPCN that you mentioned real quickly.
Okay. USPCN was Chicago-based and is self-described as a Palestinian and Arab community-based organization founded in 2006. And at its core, it's anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, with the stated goal of Palestine being free from the river to the sea, which we've discussed means the annihilation of the country of Israel. Its stated purpose was to revitalize grassroots efforts within the Palestinian and Arab communities in the U.S. The USPCN organizes campaigns and projects, especially boycott, divestment, and sanctions events, the BDS movement that we've talked about, how all these groups kind of use that as one of their rallying cries.
Right. It seems that all these groups rally around this BDS movement.
Yes. And USPCN's founder was a man named Hatem Abudaya. I don't know if I said that before. Hatem Abudaya has consistently espoused support for terror groups for more than a decade. On March 9th, 2009, Abudaya wrote an article in FightBackNews.org where he praised what he called the Palestinian resistance for being, quote, strong and unified. And then he listed several organizations that constituted the Palestinian National Liberation Movement and included designated terror fronts or designated terrorist organizations, Hamas, PFLP, the Islamic Jihad, and others. And on the note of Abudaya, in 2017, an article was published in Global Research where he praised Hamas and referred to them not as a terror group, but as, quote, resistance forces, while also promoting BDS as a form of resistance against Israel.
USPCN made fervent calls for the release of convicted PFLP terrorist Razmia Odeya when she was imprisoned in the U.S. And in fact, in 2017, when Odeya, again a convicted terrorist who was responsible for the death of 2 students and who lied on her U.S. immigration paperwork by omitting that, was ordered to be deported in 2017, and Abudaya spoke to the news media.
It was a case about Palestine from its essence. This woman was arrested, this woman was convicted, this woman had to serve 5 weeks in a county prison here in Michigan, and this woman is going to be deported only because she's Palestinian and only because she has served her community and the cause of the liberation of Palestine for 50 years.
We will continue to struggle for our cause.
Yes, and Hatem Abudaya and USPCN have long collaborated with the National Students for Justice in Palestine in the spread of anti-Israel, anti-Zionist propaganda and false narratives. For example, in a 2018 NSJP conference at UCLA themed Radical Hope, Resistance in the Face of Adversity, Abudaya was listed as a USPCN coordinating member. The conference website openly stated the purpose of the conference was to destroy Zionism. That conference was co-sponsored by SJP, AMP, PYM, USPCN, and others.
So really, Laura, what we started seeing after the AMP and SJP held their 2010 convention to reinvigorate student activism was a collaboration between the pro-Hamas groups and the Marxist pro-PFLP groups.
Yes, and it went beyond just student activism, and what went beyond just student activism was the spread of false and slanted narratives and, frankly, the spread of hate. And that continues today, both here and abroad. And we're going to end with a November 15th, 2019, a pro-Gaza rally was held in Times Square in New York, where you see elements of the SJP, AMP, and Samadou. Let's watch.
Intifada revolution! Intifada revolution! There is only one solution, Intifada revolution! There is only one solution, Intifada revolution! The Intifada does not have to be in Gaza or Palestine. We're going to have an Intifada in every classroom. We're going to have an Intifada on every college campus. We're going to shut down all the Zionist events. Just the other day, as Gaza was being bombed, the Zionist leader, the Consul General, Danny Dayan, was invited to speak at Harvard Law. And 100 students walked out of his talk, and they shut the whole event down. Let's try to do that on every college campus. Let's shut down all the Zionists, and let's start an Intifada everywhere we are.
We're here today to as well let everybody know that Palestine has a right to defend itself. Palestine, we have a right to resistance. It's a God-given right. You know, people ask, does Israel have a right to exist? No, Israel has no right to exist on Palestinian land.